My Govanen. Welcome to Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to cover this episode in both the novel and Peter Jackson's movies and how they treat differently this idea of Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli chasing after the orcs that have kidnapped Merry and Pippin. Not so much because the plot is significantly different, but because the details that we get that are different in the novel really kind of help flesh out the world and also flesh out some of the characters. Also, it's really interesting to look at how we get a lot of decision making going on, and we also get a lot of kind of character growth on the part of Pippin. This is one of his really key moments, and in Peter Jackson's movie that kind of gets boiled down to a little half thought out plan. It doesn't really do much, but we'll get to that. So before I get into the details, I should point out that for those of you who aren't familiar with the novel, maybe you haven't read it in a while and you've forgotten, or maybe you never read it, all of the events from Boromir's death onward take place in the Two Towers in the novel, unlike in the movies where in the Fellowship of the Ring we get all the way through Boromir's death and the decision for Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli to follow after Merry and Pippin as opposed to trying to follow Frodo. In the book, all of that comes in the Two Towers, and I'm not going to get into so much the decision-making of Aragorn in deciding to follow Merry and Pippin, because that's not really the focus of this video. I'll probably do one like that eventually, but I wanted to put that up front to make it a little clearer, because the way the movie cliffhangs and the way the novel cliffhangs are totally different. The novel doesn't separate the kidnap of Merry and Pippin, or at least the discovery of the kidnap in Merry and Pippin, from the chase of Merry and Pippin. That doesn't happen. So with that said, let's move forward and take a look at how the novel and the movies treat this differently. Now, of course, in the movie, as I mentioned, you get the decision to chase after Merry and Pippin in the Fellowship of the Ring movie. And then that's basically all we get. Boromir is dead. They decide to chase after Merry and Pippin, and almost the last thing we see in the movie is Aragorn saying,
"Let us hunt some orc."
And then off they go. And then we only pick up with them again in the Two Towers, where we see Aragorn doing this. And then Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli are off on the chase. And we don't really see a whole lot of anything except a couple montages of them running along. Now, the most interesting things that we see come much later, and they're not... I'm going to be covering a lot more novel right now, because the novel goes into a whole lot more detail up front and within these early stages than the movies do. So one of the first things that we see is when Aragorn searches among the bodies of the dead orcs and whatnot, and he's trying to piece together, and this is another important difference between the novel and the movie I should mention too. In the novel, Aragorn asks what happened to Frodo of Boromir before he dies, but Boromir dies before he can answer the question. In the movie, you get the idea it's the other way around. Boromir's the one who doesn't know about Frodo, and of course Aragorn has run into Frodo. Totally opposite situation. So when Boromir tells Frodo in the movie they took the little ones, he's obviously talking about Merry and Pippin, not Frodo. And so Aragorn already knows which hobbits went which way, whereas he kind of has to piece some of this together from clues. And one of the clues that he finds that's really relevant to this particular episode is in the bodies of the slain, he finds the knives that Merry and Pippin were carrying. And interestingly enough, I don't think, I'd have to go back and look to be sure now, but I don't think he actually specifies whether it's the swords that they got from the Barrow Downs in the novel, or if it's the elvish knives that they got from Galadriel in the parting from Lothlorien. I don't think it actually tells us which he's referring to. It may be both. Certainly we know that Merry does end up getting his barrow blade back, because that becomes relevant later for his confrontation with the Witch King. Totally different topic. But he finds weapons that were Merry and Pippin's nonetheless, and he basically makes a point of saying, the orcs wouldn't have wanted to touch these, and of course they would have taken them from them anyway, because you don't let a captive carry a weapon. So this is how he kind of surmises Merry and Pippin have been taken because their bodies aren't there. They're not dead. But clearly, they're not with Frodo either. He figures all this out and finally realizes, okay, I know it's Merry and Pippin, or at least seems very probable that it's Merry and Pippin that have been taken by orcs. And so we have to make this decision. He decides to go after Merry and Pippin rather than Frodo and Sam. Along with the knives, he also finds indications that there are probably two different sets of orcs running around in this general melee of people getting killed. He sees among the orc gear some that look like orcs from the Misty Mountains, and we kind of get the idea that maybe these came from the Misty Mountains as part of a hunting party trying to hunt down the Fellowship after the whole incident with the Balrog and Moria and all that stuff, because we get hints of this even earlier in Lothlorien when they first enter. There's a group of orcs that enters the Golden Wood. So the other one that he finds some weird gear that he's not familiar with a white S. And he's like, what in the world would this be? And he reasons out it's probably Saruman. One of the others, Gimli or Legolas, suggests, is it Sauron? And he's like, no, Sauron doesn't permit his name to be written or spelt, so it wouldn't be that. So he figures it's Saruman. So we've got, from the outset, seemingly, two different groups of orcs going, and this becomes really relevant later on. After Aragorn and company give chase, they run basically until night, and at close to nightfall, they run into some bodies of what look like, again, northern or Misty Mountains orcs dead on the field. And Aragorn surmises there must have been some kind of quarrel between the two factions of orcs, because there's no indications of anything else. And he says it's not uncommon for orcs to do this to each other anyway. They keep running for a while. In the morning, Legolas can see that the orcs are probably 12 leagues ahead of him at this point, which is a really long way, of course. And along the way, and here's where we start to get back a little bit to picking up with the movie, because in the movie, of course, we have the scene where Pippin takes off his brooch and then spits it on the ground for Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli to find. This happens really differently, and I'll come back to this a little bit more later, because the novel puts all these in a little bit different order. The novel follows Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli for a long time before we ever get Merry and Pippin's perspective on what's going on. So I'm following Aragorn and company for a while. But anyway, Aragorn finds a trail leading away from the main trail, almost misses it, stops, runs off, and then he finds the leaf from Lothlorien, and basically comes to the same conclusion that he does in the movie, which is, this didn't fall by accident, it was put here by purpose. And of course, the fact that there's a trail running off, unlike in the movie where Pippin is being carried on the back of an orc the whole time, makes it a little easier to figure that out. Obviously, Pippin ran off and put it there. He didn't, just happen to drop it as he was trying to run away. And Legolas makes the point that I hope he didn't pay too harshly for that. They keep running for a while, and eventually it starts to get really dark, and they have to decide, do we rest or do we continue on in the hopes that we can follow the trail? And Aragorn's like, well, if we follow the trail, we may miss it in the dark. And on the other hand, if we don't sleep, we got to sleep sooner or later. And they're also debating, the orcs, are they going to sleep? And he's like, Legolas basically says, well, these keep running in the daytime, which is really unusual for orcs. They certainly won't rest at night. And they have this debate back and forth about, all these different aspects of, are we going to miss the trail? Do we need the rest? All this. And eventually they decide they are going to sleep. So after they leave it to Aragorn to decide, and he's like, all my choices have been crummy lately, so why are you letting me pick? But he decides to sleep, and he basically says, I think the risk of missing the trail is worse. And in the morning, Legolas rather mournfully says, they're far away. They may already be to the forest. And it's like, they haven't stopped. And, Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas, they're all kind of losing hope at this point, but they're not giving up. They're going to keep following him. Before setting out again, though, Aragorn listens to the ground, and we get an echo of this in the movie, too, which I showed earlier. And he hears not so much regular feet, but he hears horses' hooves, which he finds a little bit odd. He's like, this is confusing. So anyway, they set out again, and Aragorn notes that something seems to be working against them. And of course, we have the same scene kind of in the movie as well, but it's a little bit different because by this point, of course, in the novel, Aragorn's already figured out that the orcs are with Saruman. They're Saruman's orcs. Whereas in the movie, you get the idea that he doesn't think of this until Legolas says, "Oh, the Uruks turn northeast towards Isengard," which is kind of weird. It doesn't. In the book too, Aragorn says this, and then Legolas kind of points off and points to Isengard, and it's like Aragorn suddenly has a light bulb moment, but it's not like he's just now realizing who the orcs are with. He's known that the whole time. They rest again, and then Legolas in the morning with a red dawn. In the movie, he says,
"The red sun rises. Blood has been spilled this night."
But in the book, he ends up just saying, "Strange things await us near the forest," and so they continue on. They end up coming up to another campsite where the orcs have apparently rested for some short period, and they again continue on until dark, finding nothing there, and then rest again because Aragorn and Gimli are basically tuckered out. Legolas, not so much. But the next morning, before they set out, Aragorn sees something far away on the plain and listens, and he hears the horses' hooves again, and they're coming towards them. Legolas, meanwhile, while he's listening, is looking, and he sees the horses because his eyes are so much better, and he describes what he's seeing, and he says that he can even number them, and they're miles away on the plain. And Aragorn ends up deciding we're just going to wait for him here because whatever happened out there, the horsemen were way ahead of us and did something, so there's not much point in hurrying at this stage. So eventually what happens is the riders of Rohan do arrive. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, unlike in the movie, are just sitting in the grass, but with their elven cloaks, the horsemen don't see them at all. They just ride past until Aragorn stands up and calls out to them. Éomer then, of course, has his conversation with Aragorn, which is somewhat different than the movie version, but it's not substantially different. They get around to the point of saying, we killed all the orcs. Aragorn and company are like, well, did you see any besides orcs? Éomer basically ends up saying, we didn't see anything but orcs, but a lot of exchange happens that I don't want to get into the details here. But eventually he decides to give them a couple of horses and help them out, basically saying, just come return the horses when you're done, but I don't think you're going to find anything helpful. They continue on with the horses, riding fairly slowly to make sure that there's no tracks that break off or double back towards the direction that that they'd come from, hoping against hope basically that Merry and Pippin, or one of them at least, might have escaped. They finally arrive at where the orcs were burned by the riders, and they search until dark, which is not far off by that point, but they don't find anything, so they have to wait until morning to continue the search. Gimli is kind of despairing at this point, but Aragorn doesn't want to give up, and so they decide to just, camp out there for the night. They're going to light a fire, but Aragorn warns them, don't cut anything from a living tree in Fangorn Forest. And Legolas is like, well, what do you know about the forest exactly? And Aragorn's like, I figured you would probably know more than I do. I just heard weird stories about it. It's kind of a dangerous place. Don't ask me. So there's this conversation back and forth, but at any rate, they end up doing that. And weirdly enough, when they light the fire, they're under a tree, kind of where the fire is, and describes the leaves kind of rubbing as if hands over the fire, and Legolas even makes a remark about the tree being glad of the fire, which seems really ironic. And I'm not really sure what to make of that, but it's interesting. They take it in turns to watch at night, being, at the eaves of Fangorn, not really knowing what might come from there and who knows what. But at one point, Gimli is awake, and it's his turn to watch, and he sees something on the edge of the firelight, and it looks like an old man in a cloak, kind of reminiscent of how Gandalf might be described. And he kind of starts up, and this wakes up Aragorn. Aragorn kind of tries to invite the old guy in, whoever it is, says, come and sit with us or whatever. And he even gets up to walk toward him invitingly, and then he disappears. Aragorn is being perfectly polite. There's no indication in the text that he's being duplicitous about trying to get him to come in. But after this, they kind of talk it out, and they're like, who was that? And then Legolas notices that their horses have gone, and he can even hear them in the distance. And so Gimli now has it firmly in his mind that must have been Saruman, because in their conversation with Éomer, he described Saruman as being somebody who would go around hooded and cloaked as an old man, spying things out and whatnot. And so Gimli has this idea that, yep, that must have been Saruman. But at this point, the story kind of leaves the hunters, and now we get to Merry and Pippin's view of everything. So let's take a look at that. First thing we know from the Hobbit's point of view is Pippin is waking up feeling really groggy and like he must have been knocked out or something, because he doesn't remember much. But he's waking up next to Merry. Merry has this really nasty gash on his head, which is kind of like the movie, actually. And he's trying to piece back together what had happened, and he remembers they were running through the woods crazy, trying to look for Frodo, ran into a batch of orcs. Merry actually managed to cut several of their arms off while they were trying to grab them, because the orcs weren't trying to kill them, just capture them. And so Merry fought them off. And then Boromir shows up, and then the orcs just straight out ran. After the first group of orcs run, Boromir and Merry and Pippin try to make their way back, but then they run into a second batch of orcs, which seem to be a mixed group, some of them bigger than the others. And this is going to get significant later, too. So we've got this idea that there's a bunch of these different orcs out in the woods, but anyway, Boromir keeps trying to kill orcs, and of course he ends up getting shot, and the hobbits end up getting captured. As he's lying there, he starts trying to struggle with the ropes that are tying him, and then one of the orcs nearby is like, cut it out. And then he also overhears some of the orcs saying, like, curse the Isengarders, which again plays into this idea there's more than one group of orcs here. And as he listens, he starts to pick up with the orcs' conversation that there's at least 2 or 3 different groups of them trying to argue over whether they should kill Merry and Pippin. Now, what we end up getting is we get the character of Ugluk, who appears to be the leader of the Isengarder faction, and he's all for keeping them alive, because his orders are to take the halflings alive, unspoiled, back to Isengard. Then there's another voice that kind of pops in. It's like, that's not our orders. We came from the mountains to kill, and we just want to kill and go back. So here we get that reference to the Misty Mountain orcs. But there's a third voice that pops in that has a particularly evil sound to it. And here's where we get our third group of orcs. And just for reference, in the movie, the only issue we get with 2 different groups of orcs is this little scene.
You're late. Our master grows impatient. He wants the Shire rats now.
I don't take orders from orc maggots.
Now, of course, in that scene, we got Isengarders and Isengarders, but it's like you got regular orcs and you got the Uruk-hai, and they're all Isengard orcs, which, okay, that's kind of, it's like he's paying homage to the book, but not really following the rationale for why there's different groups. In the book, you get the idea these 3 groups just kind of happen to converge in one spot for whatever reason. And the Isengarders seem to be kind of ruling things because they're the biggest, toughest, and maybe even the most numerous group, and they're the ones that killed Boromir, and Ugluk makes a point of this. At any rate, the third evil voice is also saying they should not kill the hobbits, but should take them unharmed, but he says that they should go to Lugburs, which you kind of find out later on is basically orc speech or black speech for the Dark Tower, Barad-dûr in Mordor. So this one is clearly a Mordor orc. So we've got 3 different factions. We've got Mines of Moria, Mordor orcs, and Saruman's orcs from Isengard. So we've got all these 3 different people arguing. Mordor orcs want to take them back to Mordor for obvious reasons. And he brings up the fact that there's more Mordor orcs and a Nazgul on the other side of the river, which of course at first they're not very far from because the ambush happens at the river. So he wants to take them that way. Ugluk is having none of it. In all this talk back and forth, by the way, the evil-sounding orc names himself Grishnakh. And at any rate, Ugluk basically says, if it weren't for us, you guys would have all split and run, and nobody would have the hobbits. So you just put up with us, and you can do what you want. But they also the Isengarders end up killing a few orcs. So this is like the 5 that Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli initially find when they, find those few dead ones. And then Pippin here, interestingly, takes advantage, and one of the knives of the dead orcs, he kind of just shimmies up to and very stealthily, like, cuts through his ropes, ties them back up in like a loose knot that he can undo anytime he wants, and then just lays still like nothing happened. So this is where we really start to get Pippin, picking up on, being an active player in all this. Pippin passes out again for a while, mostly being carried by orcs, and the next time he wakes up, they've stopped again, and he hears Ugluk berating one of the other orcs about a scout, apparently, on horseback, so presumably one of the Rohirrim, and basically says, why didn't you shoot him? Now they're going to know we're here and hunt us down, you idiot. At any rate, he ends up untying Merry and Pippin's legs and basically says, you're going to have to hoof it. And he pours some kind of drink down their throats, which is supposed to, we don't know what it is or what the point of it is, but it kind of invigorates them. In the movie, we get the idea that this is kind of medicine for Merry because of this scene.
Give him some medicine, boys!
But in the book, what we have is this drink which invigorates them, and then he smears some stuff on Merry's wound, which makes Merry cry out in pain. It does end up healing, but it leaves a nasty brown scar after the fact. So, I mean, it's like the orcs have their weird, nasty versions of things that you imagine the elves have. Like the elves have Miruvor, which Gandalf gives the company up in Caradhras, which invigorates them in the cold. Orcs have this, who knows what it is, and don't really want to know what it is. So anyway, part of the reason Ugluk had their legs unbound was so that they could climb down this ravine, and they're about to enter like the legit plains of Rohan. So they climb down and they keep going on, and it's getting close to daybreak. So the northern Misty Mountains orcs are starting to complain like, we can't run in the sun. And he's like, well, sucks for you. Ugluk basically says, you'll run or you'll get killed. So they keep going, and before daybreak actually hits, they hit a misty patch, and here's where Pippin gets his next big event in, because he kind of ducks under the orcs that are nearest him and runs off into the tall grass. And this is where he, takes off his brooch and throws it on the ground. Of course, he gets caught by some orcs and, gets some whiplash on his legs for his efforts, but totally worth it in the end, obviously. So at any rate, he runs on. Merry and Pippin both run on with the orcs, and they're kept separate, by the way. They're not next to each other. They don't get to talk to each other hardly at all this whole time. Pippin and Merry both are awake at this point, of course, and eventually they end up stopping once more at night, briefly, and another time in the morning. Occasionally they get picked up and carried again when they fall or something like that, but in the morning when they stop a second time, the northern orcs are, complaining about, we're going to get killed by the Whiteskins, meaning, of course, the Rohirrim. And Ugluk basically says, well, do what you want to do. Run off, you little cowards. And they just bolt north, trying to go back to the Misty Mountains. Pippin also sees, coming from the east, another group of orcs bearing the red eye, and with them is Grishnakh. So at some point between, you get the idea that his group had left Ugluk. Who knows why? We don't really know. Pippin had passed out probably at that point. But they're on their way back now. And there's another conversation between Ugluk and Grishnakh. And Ugluk basically says, he tries to make some kind of remark at Grishnakh. And Grishnach's like, well, you have some good people with you that I would rather not lose. And of course, you don't really think that orcs are thinking that charitably. It's more like he wants to get Merry and Pippin for himself, really, is what's going on. in the midst of all this banter, Ugluk ends up asking, did your Nazgul have another mount shot out from under him? Because in the book, Legolas straight up shoots a winged beat, whatever winged thing they're flying on. And Grishnakh gets really, really upset about this. And he's like, if you only knew what you were talking about, you wouldn't make light of it. But anyway, they end up starting off again, following basically the same path as the Misty Mountain orcs. And they end up catching up with and passing them, because in the sunlight, the Misty Mountain orcs are all like, they can't do it in the sunlight. Unlike the Isengard orcs. And also during this period, Pippin notices that the Mordor orcs are kind of falling behind the Isengard orcs, and he's not sure if that's because they're just slower or they're also fading from the sun, or if they're doing it kind of deliberately. At any rate, they're doing it. Next thing you know, one of the orcs is like, oh, we got horse riders on our tail. So, of course, the horsemen are catching them because they're obviously even faster than even the Uruk-hai. And before they can reach the forest, and incidentally, the Uruk-hai at this last moment, they really kind of put forth a last sprint, and Merry and Pippin are like, how do these guys still have it in them? But they're trying to catch them. They're trying to get to the forest before the Rohirrim catch them, but the Rohirrim cut them off and surround them before nightfall. And so the Uruk-hai are forced to basically make camp. Now here Merry and Pippin are actually put together, and so they do get fleeting chances to talk to each other. But again, while they've got a couple of guards with them, and the guards, while they're there, won't let them talk. But they do overhear some conversation. They hear that the Ugluk talking about the riders, basically saying it looks like they're going to wait for dawn, which stinks even for them, because they've got other orcs that aren't just the Isengard orcs. So Ugluk does say, though, that he's expecting another group of orcs coming from the forest, and so he thinks that they're going to catch the Rohirrim by surprise and take them out anyway. So Pippin, meanwhile, of course, is thinking in his head, I hope they kill him, even though it probably means I'll die. While this is going on, they hear kind of a ruckus start up, and it seems what happens, some of the Rohirrim snuck in off their horses, got in really close, and killed some of the orc sentries. And next thing you know, Ugluk is trying to prevent all of his group from stampeding, basically. And the guards watching Merry and Pippin run off to do who knows what. But Merry and Pippin at this point are like, oh, let's see if we can, make a break or something here. Pippin has explained by this point to Merry, like, my arms aren't really tied. But before they can really do anything, Grishnakh, our old buddy, comes up and grabs Merry and Pippin and makes off with them a little ways, and he starts trying to search them, apparently. Pippin figures out he's looking for the ring, probably. And so he starts talking to him in kind of vague and leading terms, like, you won't find it that way. It's not easy to find. And he's like, it? What are you talking about? And then Pippin even starts to throw in, like, Gollum voices, like Gollum, just trying to make it sound like, and then Grishnakh has this apparent light bulb moment where he's like, oh, that's what you're talking about. Very dangerous. And Pippin and Merry catches on, of course. They start trying to get him to basically, like, untie our legs and we'll help you, which is a pretty dangerous gamble. But, of course, Grishnakh is having none of that. He's like, I can carry you both. I'm plenty strong enough to do that, and I won't need your help to find it because I can tear you to shreds and find it one way or the other. So Grishnakh does pick the two hobbits up and kind of starts to sneak out between orc sentries, trying to get out undetected. And he goes a while, and just as he's about to make a dash for it, he stands up, but then a horse looms up in front of him, and he just drops the hobbits, pulls his sword out, which gives him away, and then an arrow, either by chance or by great skill, doesn't tell us which, hits him in the right hand, and then as he just tries to dash out, he gets speared by a horseman. So Grishnakh meets his well-deserved end, and Merry and Pippin are now left to basically figure out what to do next. So Pippin here unloosens his own hands. He gets Grishnak's sword, starts to untie Merry as well. Meanwhile, They eat a little bit of the lembas bread that Pippin still has in his pack to kind of recover themselves a little bit, because their legs have been tied up really tight so long that they don't even have any blood flow, so they're just kind of waiting to be able to walk. And initially they even crawl. But he basically, while they're sitting there, it sounds like battle is about to commence, and so they start making their way towards the forest while the battle is going on. And once they kind of get to the edge of the forest, they look back and they see some of the battle happening. But the battle isn't between the riders and the surrounded group. The battle is between the riders and the reinforcements Ugluk was expecting from the forest. But it turns out the reinforcements didn't help much. The riders pretty much killed them off pretty easily. So after that, the rest of the battle waits until dawn, at which point the riders attack. And then they're witnessing the battle, and Ugluk, with some of the really stout Isengarders, ends up trying to, in a body, just kind of push their way to the forest in a last desperate effort to escape. And it looks like they're gonna. And so Merry and Pippin are like, okay, we've sat around here long enough, let's go into the woods. And so here the text actually tells us that they missed the part where Eomer actually gets off his horse, fights Ugluk man to man to orc, whatever, and kills Ugluk, both of them on foot. So that ends up turning out just fine. They didn't have to run after all, but you could see why they would. They didn't want to face those guys again. And that's the last we get of Merry and Pippin's view of all of this stuff, because now the orcs are dead, of course. Now we return to the three hunters. In the morning after the encounter with the possible Saruman character, they do a little bit more looking around, and here Aragorn actually finds some clues. But before he does, he remarks that, interestingly, when he heard the horses, they sounded happy, not scared or upset or anything like that, and Legolas kind of confirms this. At any rate, they start looking around, and Aragorn finds a Malorn leaf, which Malorn is the special tree that's in Lothlorien that's nowhere else. And it's what the limbus was wrapped up in. The leaves were what were used as wrappers, basically. And so he's like, looks like we had a hobbit just kind of sit here and eat for a while. And this, starts all kinds of puzzles for the whole group of them. They're like, what the heck is going on? Gimli even finds the knife that Pippin and Merry used to cut their ropes. And Legolas is like, what did they do? Just like, how did they get the knife? How did they cut themselves off, the ropes off themselves? And then what did they do? Just fly off into the woods? Aragorn ends up, of course it's a joke sort of, but Aragorn laughs it off, and he starts pointing out other clues that he's found and pretty much guesses exactly what happened. But at any rate, they're looking at all of this, and they have to make a decision now what to do. Aragorn ends up deciding, of course, they should enter Fangorn, because if they're going to find the hobbits, they must be in there. Their trail led that way. And so they enter Fangorn, not really sure what they're going to find, but they follow the hobbits' footprints up to the point where they had actually met Treebeard, which I didn't really cover here because that's not really the point. But Aragorn is seeing, of course, Treebeard's tracks too now, and he's like, what is this? I don't know what this is. And then, of course, they have their encounter with Gandalf, which I also don't want to get into, except to mention a couple things. Gandalf ends up explaining the fact of the horses sounding glad. The horses met Shadowfax, and so that's why the horses were sounding happy the night before. But Gandalf also confirms Gimli's theory that, yeah, what you saw was probably Saruman, because it wasn't me. So that kind of rounds out the hunter's side of the story. So the interesting thing here, of course, is we see all this decision-making. I didn't go into near all the detail, because they actually have, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli have this really long debate that spans like over a page and a half, I think, where they have to decide, do we continue running in the dark or do we rest? They go back and forth multiple times. And there's all this other stuff about the internal politics of what happens when you get different groups of orcs together. There's a lot of that going on. You get the idea, Grishnakh had even mentioned, that Saruman is a treacherous fool. So you get the idea that by that point, Grishnakh already knows that Saruman is not really on Sauron's side. And so that tells you something, because he couldn't have found that out that day. They didn't have instant communication. So there's all these little pieces that we get to see that show us, the Misty Mountains orcs seem to be just kind of independent. The Mordor orcs seem to be treating everybody else as like, you're supposed to be under us. And of course, the Isengard orcs are like, nope, we're bigger, tougher. You can be under us, and if you don't like it, deal with it. Because at that point, Saruman really is out for his own ends and not really serving Sauron. So he's got his orcs doing his bidding. So the way that all works out is interesting, because you can see, orcs aren't just orcs. There's a lot of differences there. And I think we lose a lot of that with the way the movie handles it. And of course, we lose a lot of the decision-making process too. And we lose a lot of Pippin's growth as a character, because this is really the first time in the entire story where Pippin has really stepped up and done stuff. And Merry, at the end of all this, even tells him, you've done really well for yourself. In fact, you'll make an entire chapter in, the book that we end up writing about all this. Which is true, because all that stuff I covered almost about Merry and Pippin was all in one chapter, and it was all about what Pippin heard and did. So, of course, he's right. He did get a whole chapter to himself. But at any rate, you get a lot of interesting things here that you really don't get in the movie version. And I think it's just really interesting to look at those differences. Like I said, not a lot of plot change. The basic structure is all there. I mean, it's not like you change the nature of the story in any significant way, but it's a lot more nuanced and interesting in the novel. So, hope you enjoyed that comparison between the novel version and the movie version of the chase of the three hunters for the hobbits. If you did enjoy it, please do give it a thumbs up and share the video around. If you would like to follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore, you can get occasional trivia questions related to Tolkien. You can, of course, subscribe to the channel here. You can support the channel here. And you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.